varying round of proof points, which is really nice. And I'm sure that gets into how these were specifically made and selected. I mean, should we just get started and jump into 1870?
Yeah, well, and to your point, just one thing I like what you said. They're varying proof points, different flavors, and I think when we think about craft whiskey, a lot of folks think about enthusiasts, like folks who've been into whiskey for a while and they know what they're looking for. But craft whiskey is for everybody, and so I think we wanted to create a portfolio that kind of met every different consumer where they're at. So that's a great segue into 1870. You want to get into it?
Let's do it.
All right, cool. So the story behind 1870, that's this one. Yeah, you'll give us the close up there with the red label. And I mentioned already, we've been around for 153 years, which makes 1870 our founding year. So in 1870, our founder, George Garvin Brown, he was a pharmaceutical salesman who wanted to create a whiskey with integrity. There were a lot of rectifiers at the time making counterfeit whiskeys that could be harmful. And being in the pharmaceutical business, he wanted to create a reputable whiskey that people could really rely on. And so he started sourcing barrels of whiskey. He wasn't a distiller himself, from 3 reputable distilleries in the Louisville area. And that was the founding of Old Forester and therefore Brown-Forman. The really revolutionary thing he did was he bottled his whiskey in a glass bottle. Up until then, suppliers were only selling whiskey by the barrel, which was part of the lack of transparency. So that bottle with the tamper-proof seal guaranteed that what you were going to get was quality. And so that's why we're called the first bottled bourbon. That's kind of the legacy that we've led ever since then. The way that we craft the 1870, we call it original batch because we want to call back to that original batching process. But we don't need to source barrels from 3 different distilleries. We have our own. And so we kind of model that story of George Garvin Brown by using barrels from 3 different Old Forester warehouses. So we try to get a little bit of variability in the different warehouses, microclimates, entry proofs, flavor profiles that we're pulling from those 3 and batching them together for this consistent flavor profile, which George was really one of the first people to do. So that's kind of the story behind the 1870.
Well, that was great. Why don't we jump in to a tasting of it?
Let's do it. Now, we bottle this one at 90 proof, so that is going to be the lowest bottle proof that we have in the series. And to my point earlier, we wanted to create an original batch that was really accessible to every consumer. So this is going to have nice approachability for beginners who are just getting into craft whiskey, but it's also going to have a lot of complexity of flavor for those enthusiasts that are looking for a lot of nuance and a lot of subtlety.
Yeah, and what I loved returning back actually to the 1870 because now, I mean, especially in my role with a lot of high proof whiskeys, is actually at 90 proof, really getting into nuance of flavor. Like the nose is distinguished, the palate is awesome, and the finish is refined. So it's really nice when you can come back to a 90 proof after you've been really up there for a little bit and be like, actually, this is a great pour.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of enthusiasm for high proof whiskeys, cask strength whiskeys these days, which is great to see people get to kind of what they like about different expressions. But 90 proof, that's kind of one of the original proofs. The lowest you can go for a Kentucky bourbon is 80 proof. 90 is sitting right at that accessible point of ABV.
Mm-hmm.
And when you proof that down to 90, you're actually expressing a lot of nuance of flavor. So this one has a bit more finesse to it than some of our higher proof options. Lots of balance of flavor. This is going to lean into very classic Old Forester notes. So we're going to get on the nose some sweet citrus. We get kind of a nice bouquet of citrus here: blood orange, grapefruit, orange peel, citrus oils, things like that. And then you're also going to get some nice balanced spice. Old Forester is known for having kind of a clove undertone. Clove definitely present in this one as well. So we kind of balance those fruits and florals as well as baking spices in the 1870.
Awesome. Well, cheers.
Cheers. You're right. That 90 proof, just super refined.
Oh, perfect.
Easy sipper. Also great to mix with. So Old Forester, our signature cocktail is an old fashioned because of that sweet citrus and spice balance. This one is great in an old fashioned with an orange peel garnish because you're going to cut through those sweeter demerars and syrups. You're going to have some nice marrying of the citrus with the garnish. I also love this in something like a whiskey sour. So I know people are always afraid to maybe mix with their craft whiskeys, but it also makes a really elevated cocktail.
I also love this one because I get like baked goods in
Mm-hmm.
that finish. So I get like it's almost like the cinnamon sugar cookie and
Ooh,
like
yeah, like a snickerdoodle.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, Lee. That's a great one. I think that that's a nice kind of marrying of that sweet and spice that we get from the balance there.
absolutely. Now we did have a question in the batching. This is probably a great time for that question. Is you know, can you tell us a little bit about the journey to becoming a master taster? And I mean, what is that like? Kind of maybe in total or on the daily. What does that look like?
Yeah, I guess we kind of skipped over the whole master taster bit, dove right
Yeah.
into whiskey. Who can blame us? Well, first of all, a lot of people want to know what a master taster is because I think we're all pretty familiar with master distillers. You know, they're in charge of the entire production process. A lot of folks at this point have heard of master blenders who really work on the finished goods. You know, post maturation, really marrying those flavors together, like the original batch for a consistent profile. Master tasters really work kind of in an apprenticeship role under a master blender, master distiller, and master tasters are in charge of ensuring the quality of the product. So we do a lot of sensory paneling and making sure that the product that we put out is consistent and it's high quality. And then here at Old Forester, it also means that I'm working a lot on innovation. So I'm a collaborator in the innovation process. When we talk about whiskey row expression,
Mhm.
possibly if we want to ideate something new in the future. 117 series, which is a distillery only series we put out here at our Whiskey Row distillery. We put out, a couple of those a year with some really innovative kind of uh, what's the word I'm looking for? We kind of play around with techniques that we maybe haven't tried out yet. Experimental. There's the word I'm looking for. Experimental. The 117 series is something I work heavily on.
Oh
Birthday
my gosh.
bourbon, which we just celebrated, and
Yep.
so that's kind of the role of the master taster. I also function as a brand ambassador, so I get to do cool stuff like this with you, meet with consumers out in the market. So my day to day is really pretty variable. It's different every single day. Sometimes I'm at the distillery on Whiskey Row. Sometimes I'm out on the road and market. Sometimes I'm working in the distillery with our production teams, which is just the way I like it. I kind of like my days to be different. Kind of breaks up the monotony.
Yeah, and I will say the last two times I've been in town, I've been able to get some of those experimental releases. So keep them coming. They are so fun.
Yeah, 117 series, super fun series to follow for us. We do only release those at the distillery, but if you're ever in Kentucky, definitely try and snag one. We really try to kind of hone in on single variables of our process with these whiskey row expressions and release kind of experimental, very small batches with those.
Great. Well, let's jump into the 1897. So this is your bottled and bond release. Um, why don't we jump into kind of the nuances of flavor here, and then let's talk about what does it mean to be bottled and bond.
Yeah, absolutely. So the bottled and bond for us, bottled and bond is a extra set of regulations you have to follow, but there's nothing that has to do with flavor. So for us, we get to kind of craft what we want the flavor profile of our bottled and bond to be, and where we kind of lean into those fruits and florals with the original batch. Our bottled and bond is kind of the other end of the spectrum. We get a lot of woods and spices. Feel
Hmm.
free to kind of explore that on the nose. A lot more barrel characteristics with the bottled and bond. And when we're talking fruits, we're talking darker, richer, and a lot more dried fruits. Dried cranberry is a note that I get on the nose of the bottled and bond quite a
Oh
bit.
wow,
Nuttiness, roasty toastiness, as I like to call it, and then some of that barrel influence, those oaks and cedars, and a little bit of char.
awesome. Yeah, I also get this like nice sweetness, almost like that vanilla caramel, like somewhere in there, and it's really nice to get that char in with that sweetness in the front.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think that this one has kind of the dessert factor, but because it's got a nice bold backbone of spice,
Hmm.
it kind of brings out that kick and it balances those out a little bit.
Yeah. Well, let's jump in. Cheers. Now at 100 proof, I mean, you really can't. I mean, this is I think for me actually kind of my proofing and where I go with like old-fashioned Manhattans. For me, this is like that Manhattan pour, and I think it just goes together really well in that cocktail recipe. And so, like for me, this is like that super balanced Manhattan.
Yeah, I agree with you wholeheartedly. It has this kind of black pepper note to it, especially
Mm-hmm.
that I think balances really well with like your sweet vermouth. Because Manhattans are not as sweet as old fashions, but they do have a
Absolutely.
sweet factor to them. I think you're absolutely right. The proof is really nice for that kind of more booze forward cocktail. I would absolutely put this one in a Manhattan or something comparable. I also really like to use this one because it has a little bit more backbone to it in spice, something like a Gold Rush or something really
Oh
citrus.
wow. Yeah.
This is one of my absolute favorites to put in a cocktail like that, especially as we get into autumn. You get those kind of autumnal spices from it, and it's really fun to mix with, but also great by itself because that 100 proof is right there in the middle. A lot of people love 100 proof, and it has that nice spice factor that I think people are looking from bourbon versus other styles of whiskey.
Absolutely. Well, let's continue on this journey down Whiskey Row. So we're headed towards 1910.
Yeah,
Um,
the 1910, very beloved expression in the Whiskey Row series, partially because of the flavor profile, which we get into. But first, I want to tell you a story about it because it really is a neat part of Old Forester's history. I mentioned that we're the first bottle of bourbon. We have a lot of firsts in our history because we've been around so long. And this one was kind of an accidental first. So I'm currently standing in our Whiskey Row distillery, 117, 119 Whiskey, South Main Street. And this was our site from 1882 to 1919. So super historic site for us. We get to reside here now, which is a very cool thing to get to do. But in 1910, there was a fire here in this building, and we had whiskey that had been proofed and batted, ready to go in bottles. That whiskey had to be pulled off the bottling line and dumped into new charred oak barrels to kind of
wow.
salvage from the fire. And we kind of accidentally created the first double barrel bourbon, which now today with all the finishing trends and projects that folks have worked on in innovation, double barreling is a big conversation. But back in 1910, it was a foreign concept. So Old Forester didn't even want to name it Old Forester at the time because it tasted wholeheartedly different. And so Owsley Brown, our president at the time, named it Old Fine Whisky, which is named it kind of in homage to that.
That's awesome. And coming in at 93 proof, I mean, is this also an homage to that story, or is this really just where you find this is just really well balanced, a great pour?
Great question. The 93 proof is really where we thought the flavor presented itself best. Yeah, so it doesn't necessarily play into that history, but the way that we craft this one is we age to fruition barrels of Old Forester. We actually dump them and proof them to 100 proof. So
Okay.
if you've ever had our core expression, the signature 100 Old Forester bottle, it's got the little orange accents on it. We basically craft that product and then we dump it into heavily charred oak barrels. So it's at 100 proof going into that second barrel. That has to do with solubility of those barrel
Mhm.
components we want to pull from the secondary aging. But 93 is where we feel like it comes out best in the bottle.
Awesome. All right.
Let's give it a nose.
Yeah. So
Lots of
for me,
layers to this one on the nose. Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, this is great. I mean, it's kind of bright. I get those like I get like strawberry, cherry, like those darker fruit notes. Really prevalent compared to the other two, which is a great start. Those are some of my favorite notes. So anytime I'm there, I'm like, oh, hello.
Absolutely. Yeah, I always say this one's really juicy on the nose.
Hmm.
And it's kind of interesting. We get the benefit of having a fully matured bourbon. So we're getting those sweet aromatics like the caramels, the toffees, the richness, the spice from that 100 proof that we have already crafted. And then out of the second barrel, first of all, we char a little bit longer. We actually char those barrels for over a minute. So
Oh
we're
wow.
getting that roasty toastiness there, but we're also pulling a lot of the fruit effects that we get from barrel aging because we're only finishing that for about a year. So typically when you age your bourbon 4, 5, 6+ years, you're actually moving past a lot of that fruit influence and you're pulling a lot more of those sweet aromatics, like as we'd like to talk about. The secondary aging on this keeps us in that fruit range, which I think makes us really juicy on the nose.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Cheers.
Cheers, try it out. So the profile on the palate I think you get less of that kind of juicy fruitiness, and this
Totally.
gets into what I was talking about with the char. I think this one has tons of like coffee bean kind of roastiness to it, a lot of
Absolutely.
this to it, super rich, and the viscosity. I mean, you can tell the good folks at home, the mouthfeel on this one is just really heavy and really bold.
Yeah, it kind of gets you ready for that next sip. You're like, hey, I'm ready for more.
Yeah, leaves you wanting more. And I don't know if you want to hold the bottle up for folks to see, but the color on this one totally speaks to a double barrel compared to the rest of the series. It's super dark. It kind of gets you ready for those kind of darker, roasty, toasty, nutty notes that you're going to be getting from it.
Yeah, and I fell asleep on the 1897 too. So I missed my chance to show off the 1897.
Yeah, give that one its moment. It's
Yeah,
5 minutes.
there you go. It was feeling left out over here.
Yeah.
All right, and so that brings us to our fourth and final uh, release in the Whiskey Row series. So tell us about 1920.
1920, Prohibition style. So everybody loves to talk about Prohibition. Worst time in America, best time to kind of talk about and tell stories about, because it was a very unique time in the whiskey industry, especially here on Whiskey Row. Really wiped out a lot of the business. But 6 distillers were able to continue selling whiskey under medicinal whiskey license. So Brown-Forman was one of those 6 distillers, which is part of the reason Old Forester's been around continuously without interruption before, during, and after Prohibition. So as part of the Whiskey Row series, we obviously had to kind of pay homage to that medicinal whiskey style. Now today we enter our barrels at 125 proof. That's where we feel like it ages best. Back then during Prohibition, nobody was entering barrels at 125. The standard was actually 100 proof barrel entry. And so when we put Old Forester in those barrels at 100 proof, and then we barrel age them in the warehouse, the angel share factor, as we all know, sometimes causes proof to fluctuate. So at the time, typically that proof would increase, and a lot of medicinal whiskey was barreled at barrel strength, right around the 110 to 115 mark. So we've crafted the Prohibition style. It's our highest proof option in the portfolio at 115 proof, which is really popular these days. We talked about kind of the love for some higher proof, a little bit of oomph coming from your ABV. But the profile that we've gone for on this one is really confectionery. So this is probably going to be our dessertiest of the 4. Before I get into it, let's go ahead and taste it.
All right. Oh, and I missed my chance again. Dang. Right. I'm paying too much attention. I just need to show off the bottle.
That's okay. It's not. It's what I call a happy problem.
Yeah. Oh man. That's awesome. So I'm getting like your toastier notes, which is really fun. Some cinnamon, almost like some marshmallow in there.
Absolutely. So you hit the nail on the head. I always say this is kind of like our s'mores type profile. It's got a lot of marshmallow, cinnamon, absolutely spot on. Graham cracker, also a super common one with this one. So kind of similar to 1870, where we get that kind of like bakery sweetness, but this one a little bit more depth to it with the graham cracker. So a lot of people compare this to s'mores. If you've ever been to our distillery on Whiskey Row, we sell these things called Majeskas, which is a uniquely Louisville piece of candy, typically marshmallow encased in caramel. We also dip ours in dark chocolate and top them with crunchy stuff. And usually people will enjoy their Majeskas with the 1920. It's a beautiful pairing, lots of kind of symmetry between those flavors.
Yeah, don't tempt me with a good time. That sounds awesome.
If you're ever in Louisville, come get our Majeskas. They're delicious.
I'm going to have to, absolutely. All right, well, cheers. Let's jump in.
Cheers.
Oh, yeah, that really continues throughout. That is awesome. And I get some great chocolate notes in there. Wow. And that finishes a long lasting finish.
With the 115 proof, that finish coast super long. You continue to enjoy almost like the slight bitterness of a dark chocolate. You get that sweet confectionery note from kind of the toasted marshmallow. Really subtle note in this one that's part of what you get from the barrel is like a toasted coconut.
Oh, cool.
So just a lot of kind of candied and roasty toasty in this one.
I went back for the coconut. I needed to check that out. Yeah, and I think, as a prohibition style, such a great era, I think, to also pay homage to, right? To your point, I mean, Old Forester really continued, through that era, but also such a great way to just kind of celebrate what was, and I mean, actually the production of some really great spirits during that time frame.
Yeah, I think a lot of people think about, the negative parts of prohibition, which it was a terrible time for the whiskey industry, but it was also a time when the whiskeys that you could find medicinally, like Old Forester, we were putting out Old Forester that had been aging in warehouses. We started
Mm.
other brands that didn't have whiskey licenses. I mean, it's a really interesting time if you're into bourbon history to kind of go back and see all of the movement in the industry before, during, and then coming out of prohibition. Really kind of transition time for the industry. And with the prohibition style, I think there's kind of some fun ways you can mix with this one as well, kind of playing with that higher proof. Um, Boulevardier is my favorite cocktail in the bourbon
Awesome.
realm, and it's using sweet vermouth and Campari, so you're going to get kind of bitterness coming from those mixers. I think this one pairs super well with it. It kind of gives that chocolatey undertone, and it makes a really good Boulevardier. So if anybody likes drinking Boulevardier at home, this is the one to use.
That's actually great timing because Negroni Week is next week. So
Oh, you're right. That's right.
yeah,
No, we need
get
a
those
Boulevardier week.
Boulevardiers
This
going for
is a great.
sure. This is a great way to make it work for sure.
Yeah.
So we had two questions come up. I may have missed a few. If I missed a few, feel free to drop it back in. I'm trying to keep up as we're having this conversation. But one was, what is your preferred like bitters as you're making cocktails like an old fashioned? Um, like, do you have any flavor preferences, any type preferences? I have a few. I also don't use simple syrup in any of my drinks anymore.
Yeah,
So,
I'm definitely a Demerara fan, and I'll even go with like a rich Demerara, which is two
mm,
parts sugar to the water. So
yeah.
I agree with you on that one. The bitters question is great. I am not, first of all, not a mixologist. I don't come from a bartending background, so I wholeheartedly trust the folks behind the bar that are making my cocktails and what kind of the influence that they put into their own craft. But if I'm making my own, Angostura bitters are going to be a classic. So if I'm looking for something classic, that's usually what I'm going to use, and they're always in the house. Old Forester actually puts out our own line of bitters, and we have a cinnamon bitters that I love to just kind of add an extra layer to an old fashioned, especially in the fall. And sometimes I'll even use a maple syrup instead of a demerara with those cinnamon bitters. It's just like November in a cup. So I love using something like that. We also have some Bohemian bitters that have like a bit more aromatics to them. So that's a fun one to play around with. Also fruit bitters, cherry, orange, if I'm going for something
Awesome.
a little bit more fruit forward. So not necessarily outside of your standard realm. What do you like to use, Lee? I'm interested because you said you have some opinions.
Yeah, I mean, so on the sugar category, I actually really love using maple syrup now instead of simple. Demerara is great as well. Sometimes I have trouble finding it for whatever reason. I don't know what's. I'm probably just not looking in the right places, but I think making your own simple is a lot of fun. I recently did a thyme simple syrup, and that was a great way to just create a really unique variation in an old fashioned, like
Oh
pull out
yeah,
some very
infusions
very
in here.
different, more like savory notes.
Yeah,
And
that
then,
sounds.
yeah, and then on the bitter side, I usually go aromatic, black walnut, or cherry.
Yeah, I love a black walnut. Forgot about that one. I'll have
Yeah,
to.
black walnut just hits right. I think it's the same thing of what like I think maple syrup does instead of simple. It's like it enhances some of those characteristics that you get from the bourbon that you're using. And so
Mhm.
you really kind of think about how it's either a complement to or an enhancer of like those flavor profiles that you're pulling from that specific bourbon.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, wholeheartedly agree.
Okay, we also got a difficult question. I have an opinion on this, but I wanted to see if you had one. So comparing comparing the double barreling that is done in Old Forester to double oaked from Woodford.
Oh yeah, great question. There are some comparisons and some contrasts. So both of them, obviously, a double barrel product. We use cousin yeast strains, so we're going to get a lot of similar flavor profiles from the proprietary yeast that we use for Old Forester versus Woodford, but a little bit of differentiation there as well. There will be some differences in the base spirit that we use as well. Just for Old Forester, that 100 proof that I was talking about, and the core Woodford have some differences in the entry proofs that we go to a barrel. Woodford and barrel a little bit lower than Forester, which means we're getting kind of different influences from maturation. And then we have some slight differences in fermentation as well. They ferment a little bit longer. They're looking for a lot more of those esters and kind of more delicate notes. So the base spirit's going to have a bit of variability. The yeast strain is going to have a bit of variability, but then the secondary barrels that we use are also going to be a bit variable. First barrel aging is going to have some variation on our toast and our char. So something that's unique about Old Forester and Woodford is that we toast 100% of our barrels before we char them. Woodford toasts for a bit longer than Old Forester and chars for a little bit less. That secondary barrel, we're going to have a much heavier char. Woodford's going to have a much heavier toast. So that all kind of sounds confusing and convoluted. You can really tell the difference if you sit them next to each other. But really, that secondary barrel is going to have a lot of what I call ooey gooey flavors. I use really terms out of that secondary barrel because their toast is going to be super long. So you're going to get a lot of, like I say, like when you slow roast a marshmallow, you get those wood sugars caramelizing. Whereas we're going to be getting a lot more char influence because we're going to be charring our barrel. So that's kind of production-wise how we vary the flavor. As far as flavor notes that are different, you got me there. I'm going to have to sit down with a bottle of Woodford Double Oaked and jot down the differences. But I implore everybody to go out, get a bottle of both, and kind of come up with your own opinion.
Yeah, I think for me, I get a little bit more of your oak forward notes on double oaked, Woodford Double Oaked. And here I get a lot more of your kind of sweeter, deeper notes on the Old Fine. And so, yeah, I agree. You should go get both and sit down with them. I also would love to see how these evolve with a cube. So as that just kind of allows it to kind of evolve. I think these would be interesting to see kind of at what level you would actually really enjoy both.
Absolutely. And throw that in a blind. And then,
Oh
no
man.
preconceived notions, all just flavor opinions.
Yeah, I mean, actually knowing now like this is double barreled, it's a great blind side by side to do with some friends. That would be a lot of fun.
All right, this is everyone's homework.
Yeah, everyone has homework now. You didn't know you were coming to get homework. You can get both actually on Reserve Bar right now. There's the ad. But Melissa, I know we're kicking off now. Whiskey's Worth Knowing with you, right? So Whiskey Worth Knowing is our way of giving you an introduction into a number of great whiskey releases during Bourbon Heritage Month. That includes Old Forester's 1910, as well as two Jack Daniels releases. That'll be Gentleman Jack and then a Jack Single Barrel, as well as Woodford Reserve, your standard Woodford Reserve, which is actually one of my favorite pours. It's in my whiskey closet constantly. And so if you want to try a variety of pours from a similar kind of whiskey family, you can get Whiskey Worth Knowing on Reserve Bar. It's a special package that we have during Bourbon Heritage Month to allow you to get to know the nuances of flavor from three really renowned, well-storied brands, and be able to kind of experience those together. That's another piece of homework. You need to go get all four of these and try them side by side. I think it's always interesting to look at essentially bourbon, but it from Jack Daniels, and look at kind of the influence of the Lincoln process and what they're doing down there in Tennessee. But then knowing that Old Forester and Woodford are really just a few dozen miles away, and producing some really unique unique flavors that are very distinct from each other.
Wonderful ad. Yes. Run, don't walk to Reserve Bar to get all of those.
Awesome. And then before we go, you're going to be the first to know if you're still watching us. So we had an incredible barrel proof single barrel release with Old Forester. I still have just a little bit of mine in my hand. So we had a barrel proof release that occurred earlier this year. It sold out in, I think, an hour. It was a really quick one. But Melissa and I had an opportunity to hang out and we picked another one. And so I'm looking forward to having that come out. It will be a part of our Top Flight series, which is our Reserve Bar exclusive single barrel program. And that will be out before the end of the year. So you can go and look at our Top Flight series, join our email, be the first to know. You're the first to know it here. We have not told anyone else, but we're so excited to be able to get another barrel proof selection. And Melissa, to have that experience with you was just so much fun.
Yeah, great times picking on our platform here at the distillery. And yeah, I'm glad that everybody has a little tip. Make sure you watch your inboxes because it's going to go pretty fast again.
Absolutely. Well, Melissa, thank you so much for taking the time to walk us through Whiskey Road. This series is just such an astounding way to experience whiskey and get to know kind of the nuances. I love that celebration of time, but also how distinct every one of these releases is and gives you something new to experience. So you're doing some great work. You're doing the Lord's work over there.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Lee. It was an honor. Always great hanging out with you. And thanks to everybody who tuned in this evening to spend some time with us.
And again, if you would like any of the releases we just talked about, you can go to Reserve Bar right now. We've also been sharing them in the live stream, so you can click on those links and get to them immediately. We did give you a little bit of homework, so let us know how that goes. You can follow Reserve Bar or go and follow Melissa and let us know what you think about each of these releases. And be on the lookout for future Whiskey Worth Knowing live streams. We'll be back next week and the week after. Jack will be next week, followed by Woodford Reserve the week after. So, Melissa, again, thank you so much. Thank you for the fantastic pours.
Cheers, Lee. Thanks, everybody.
Cheers. Thanks, everyone.